All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming in to this talk. Hopefully, it'll be worth 30 minutes of your time. By way of introductions, my name is Chua. I'm from a small research and analysis firm called AvidThink, which you may not recognize. But AvidThink is the spin-out of SDX Central Research. So SDXCentral.com is a company that I co-founded with my partner about 8 years ago now. And as you probably know, SDX Central has been covering the SDN, NFV, SD-WAN, 5G IoT edge, whatever it is, right? That was interesting in networking. Been doing that for the last 7 or 8 years. And so we continue the same mission as a research and analysis firm. We still publish reports in the space. And so given that this afternoon we have an ecosystem track, when we were putting the content together, we saw that there was a time and I looking at the track content, seemed like there was a need for, well, maybe there isn't, but just in case, there was a need for just a very small primer around the open source and networking ecosystem. This is, after all, the ecosystem track. So we should probably just put a couple of things out there just to get us all on the same page. And again, as you will see, this is a very, very broad space. It's very difficult to cover everything in a short span of 30 minutes. In fact, it's difficult to cover it in a short span of 300 minutes. So I'm going to walk this way now. And I'm going to talk very carefully so I don't create feedback. It's not very good to be in your own echo chamber. So let me go ahead and see if I can get started. So feel free to ask questions along the way. Happy to answer those questions. In general, if I don't know the answer, time is here. So I think we'll be good. Excellent. So you've heard the phrase "software is eating the world," right? Mark Andreessen, right? Software is eating the world. And if software is eating the world, and open source is eating software, as we all like to say, because we all pretend we're in open source, right? We pretend we know what we're doing in open source anyway. Then the question is open source eating the world? Maybe it is, but we'd like to think that, right? And so what does open source eat if it's eating the world? So open source eats proprietary hardware, right, with TIP and OCP and the like. Open source eats proprietary software, all the stacks from a lot of vendor names that we shall not name here, but some of you may work in those places still, but you know what? We're all open source companies now, right? And maybe open source eats people, right? So, and what do I mean by that? I think, one of the things that's happening if you look at open sources with AI, ML, automation, and the like, some of those roles may be transformed. We like to say transform. We don't like to say layoffs. We'll just say transform, right? So moving to a higher plane, if you will, right? So anyway, so just to sort of talk about the scope of open source, essentially, right? What are we talking about? There's a wide breadth of open source, a lot of different types, different categories, right? Ranging from hardware design. We never thought we would open source hardware, did we? And now we have open source hardware, right? So you look at, open rack. Okay, well, we'll open source the rack, so to speak, right? We'll open source the components in there, right? Open CPE, we'll open up the RAN. And maybe we'll open up the chip architecture as well, potentially, right? So there's no limit to where sort of open source can go. We'll see. Software architectures, right? We look at different architectures. Maybe we'll open source the architecture. We'll make it open so everyone can conform to it, right? Lean NFV, the MAP LSO framework, as you will. We'll open source languages. I've never thought of languages really as closed source, but say we did. But networking, P4. You've heard enough P4 by now, probably this morning, right? If you count the number of instances of P4 this morning, you could probably make money if they gave you 10 cents each. We should do P5 or P6 or P7, whatever that means. But the other thing is open source components, DPDK, I think we all know and love. FIDO, VPP, some of us know and love, I don't know, right? Software platforms, OpenStack, OVS, OpenSwitch, ONOS, ODL, ONIE, and now Stratum, open sources of today, right? So finally came out. We were hoping and waiting, but it's made it after a lot of efforts and I'm sure a lot of IP protection type stuff that's been worked behind the scenes. So it's good it's out now. Applications, I call them applications. I don't know, you could call them routing, but some of these are not routing, right? So Quagga, Snot, I don't know if you remember Snot, but Snot is an open source IDS, right? Protocols, OpenFlow, the MEF LSO framework, Sonata, all the musical names and so on. And then reference implementations, right? OPNFV, reference implementation, CBA, COMAC, right? Things that used to be known as Chord or sons and daughters of Chord, right, so to speak, and more. All right, so what's the evolution? So I think, open source and networking sort of, we talk about SDN as the first instance of open source and networking, right? We say, oh, back in 2011, 2012, OpenFlow came out, and all of a sudden, networking is open. Well, the reality is that, it depends on how you define networking, because for the older people in the room, like me, for instance, not Timon, but me, there was a pre-SDN era. I don't know if some of you remember that, right? There was a lot of open source out there that ostensibly had to do with networking, right? HTTPD, right? Links, Gopher, Veronica, anyone, right? The Washington University FTPD, right? Great for distributing software. Bind, which powered a big part of the internet for a long time, right? And a bunch of Unix daemons, right? So to speak, Quagga, Bro, Suricata. So pre-SDN, there was already a lot of open source in networking. A lot of Unix systems had a lot of open source. But then along came SDN, and all of a sudden, I think we all saw the light, or we all saw the opportunity if it made sense to us. So OpenFlow, Minet, Beacon, some of those, Knox POX, Knox Classic, that we don't hear of anymore, we don't talk about anymore, right? Floodlight, right? ODL, ONOS, these still live on, kind of. OpenStack Neutron. So from there, then it just kept going. The vSwitches, OVS, that's still around and still very powerful. OVN, that's being split out of OVS now. I think it's now completely separated. That operation was successful to separate the Siamese twins, if you will, right? So OVN is now outside of OVS. OpenSwitch, Quagga, free-range routing. And then NFV came along after SDN because we said, hey, that's cool. Open networking is cool, but let's virtualize the entire sort of telco stack with network functions as well. So OpenStack, DPTK, IOVisor, and so on. Chord, COMAC, CBA, OMAC, Volta. Say that very quickly 10 times. And then Starling, Acrano on the edge, right? Starling X, sorry, Acrano. And then orchestration. So over the years, over the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years, right, all these projects came on. And you see them sort of rise in popularity, and then they get embedded into systems, and then the next wave comes along because you get to solve the next level of problems, if you will, right? Once you get the stuff in the switches going, get stuff in the NFV stack going, you now realize you have an orchestration problem. So what happens? OSM, ONAP, right? MEF, LSO. Right? And then in the meantime, in parallel, the hardware guy says, hey, we want in too, right? So we're going to run open source or open design on the hardware side, Sonic, Stratum, DNOS, Danos. That's the other one that hasn't come out yet, Danos. We're still waiting for that one. It's supposed to come out last year, like a year ago, and it's still not out, but eventually it will come out if we talk enough about it, right? And then ORAN, right? So, all right. Anyone from Linux Foundation here? Sorry. Anyway, so anyhow. So speaking of Linux Foundation and the ecosystem, so those of you in the room who may not be familiar, here are some names that you might want to take down, and probably all of you already know all these and know and love these organizations, and there are more, right? I forgot the Broadband Forum, so sorry about that. But BBF, obviously is trying to participate as well in open source. So Apache, has been around for a long time. The MEF has been around for some time too, and the MEF is, I would say, quite successfully reinvented itself, as Carrier Ethernet, sort of became, I wouldn't say commoditized, became widely available and commercialized, and they had to look for the next wave, and now they're very, very hot in SD-WAN, so to speak, right? Everyone is hot in SD-WAN, but that's their OpenStack Foundation. So I'm still trying to stay relevant, right? OpenStack was really hot for a little while, and a little less so now, but they are, with Starling X and some work around containers, certainly still a powerhouse. Etsy, who used to do standards and now realized it was an open source organization after all as well, right? So trying to do something around there. And OCP, TIP, the Telecom Infra Project, Linux Foundation, and of course, the ONF, that's why we're here today, and the TM Forum as well. So interestingly enough, a lot of standards bodies that have in the past just focused on standards are now open source organizations too, because it is the thing to be, right? It's the in thing. And there's a lot of independent projects, so let's not forget the independent projects out there. They still live, they still exist. I almost forgot about them, but I was actually at an open source show by O'Reilly, OSCon, up in Portland, and reminded that they still exist. On the side aisles, it's kind of nice. I feel bad for them a little bit, but on the side aisles in OSCon, the big commercial companies in the middle, and they have these side aisles where they give free booths to the forgotten open source projects, like, so the Perl Foundation still exists, things like that, right? So I thought that was really nice. And it sort of walked down memory lane, and BSD is still around, right? The BSD distribution, FreeBSD, NetBSD, things like that. Anyhow, they exist, and many of them are still important, and there are still some important open source projects out there that are in open source networking that are not under any of the foundations yet, like BERT, for instance, right, in routing. So we're not done. There's still innovation out there that's outside of the large organizations. So there's a layered view of open source and networking, and you can slice it many different ways. I'll show you one slice that tries to be generic because it's our slice. But fundamentally, there is a hardware infrastructure layer, the NFVI, the KVMs, things like that, right? The network virtualization layer, your OVS, OpenSwitch, Stratum type stuff. Control and management, your ONOS, if you will, or ODL, or pick your favorite controller out there. Faucet, anyone? I guess not. No one knows about Faucet, do you? Okay, never mind. It still is a thing. So Open Faucet as an SDN controller still exists, by the way. It's out there. It was dating the ONF for a little while, but I think it's independent for the time being. Anyhow, but they still exist. Control management, application infrastructure, and applications. So all the container infrastructure, and then you have the applications, if you will. And then on one side, you have service and orchestration, because now that is important, right? Before proprietary, and now with ONF, OSM, XOS, potentially, right? Those things are important. And on the other side, let's not forget analytics and assurance. Because as we get out there now, you see a lot more focus on analytics and assurance, and that's why a lot of Nick's talk was on verification and telemetry in INT, right? So it shows maturity, over time. So anyhow, that's one view. There is a second view. This is a little dated, so I'll apologize. I was not able to find an updated version of this. This is from the Linux Foundation's Harmonization 2.0. I don't know when we had 1.0, but it was from Harmonization. I think it was a 2.0 paper. But fundamentally, it's their view of the ecosystem, and a lot of boxes around those that are all Linux Foundation hosted, right? So OVS, IOVisor, all of these at the different levels. And so fundamentally, on the layered basis, is not very different from the generic model, right? And then obviously the standards bodies on that side with the ONF logo. I just want to point out. So we have a new logo with the ONF, and it looks a little more current. Anyhow, but then speaking of the ONF, here is a different view, right? In terms of layering. Again, there's always a hardware layer, infrastructure, software, and then as you'll see, a lot of the focus is around that middle layer for the most part. And then the orchestration layer, I think, continues to make progress. And then there's other standards that are out there on the right-hand side. So different ways of viewing the stack. But fundamentally, a layered view. Fundamentally, open source has eaten just about every level, right? From the very bottom to the very top, and all across from the left to the right. So I think that's definitely maybe a good thing, maybe not. But it depends, on your view, right? So if you look at, and this is my take on it, right, which is if you're a cloud provider, yeah, you love open source and networking because certainly you can take advantage of it, as we all well know. And sometimes they give back, and sometimes not. Depends on, your view. The service providers, the ones that power the ONF, right? They love open source networking. A lot of them are trying to take advantage of it, right? The key word here is trying. It's not easy, as we well know. And they're trying to figure out how to give it back, with exceptions of a few, right? Like AT&T obviously knows how to give it. They don't give it back. They seed it in the first place. But again, right, it's AT&T with a lot of money, right? So on the enterprise side, they're not sure how to deal with open source networking because they have no idea, right, yet, right? They don't know how to take advantage of it because they don't know how to deal with it. They're probably going to consume it not directly. And of course, they're like, give what back, right? And then finally, we have the vendors who really do hate open source networking in some cases, but they have to tell you they love it because it's important to them, and they'll show you how they will help you take advantage of open source if you just use their stuff, right? That's the vendor view. And sometimes they do give back, so I think to be fair to them, right? So good. So that's different viewpoints. And so if you look at open source and networking, and this was a hard part in trying to put the talk together, is where are the boundaries really, right? I mean, so where do we stop? It's really hard to stop. I mean, you start with the hardware. You say, well, okay, with the hardware, you got Sonic, or ONIE, you got P4, you got orchestration, you got security. We don't talk about security here, but security is a thing, by the way, in networking. It's important. Bro, Suricata, and a whole bunch of other open source, things in there. Automation that we haven't talked about a lot, actually, but it's important as well, and in fact is rising in importance. And in many, many cases where SDN couldn't make headway or couldn't be monetized, automation is. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, which I won't get into today. But application infrastructure, the service mesh, we're going to eat a service mesh too. We're not going to let service mesh eat us. We're going to eat the service mesh before it eats us. So we can claim that service mesh is part of open source networking too, maybe, right? But it's hard, so we want in. And so we've invented the network service mesh, NSM. It's a thing. Linux Foundation has it incubating. Then you have infrastructure, KVM, network service mesh, see, right there, Calico. Analytics, Panda, and more, right? And so I think the difficult thing with open source and networking is, where do you draw the boundaries? Where does it stop? And I don't know if there is a clear boundary for open source and networking. And whether it's a problem or not, depends on your point of view. But some of the timely topics, if you will, in open source networking, right, which is because there's no boundaries and because there's so many projects, it's almost impossible to keep track of it. I've given up. Right? Back at SDX Central, when we first started, yeah, Tom has it on his head, but I don't. Right? So it's impossible. We started something called a directory, the SDX Central directory, where we started putting stuff in there, and then we gave up. It's just too many, right? And the problem is that just cataloging it doesn't really help you, right? Because how do you keep track of the projects, and what do you do about one-hit wonders, right? Remember, right? It's hard for now, and then it goes away, and now what, right? What do you do, right? And so I think, the good thing about open source, and, whether it's 1,000 flowers or 100 flowers, depending on whether you're looking at the Mandarin version or the English version, it's 100, by the way, in the Mandarin version. Anyhow, Darwinism and assisted pruning. What do I mean by that? I'm not talking about AI. I'm talking about the situation where I think one of the responsibilities of open source organizations, I think there's two elements, right? One is you can let Darwinism take its place, right? Let the people out there decide. And I think Darwinism is okay, except in situations where the life cycle takes too long. And that's the danger, right? Which is that we all run after, say, 10 projects. We invest a lot of resources. AT&T backs this, Verizon backs this one, T-Mobile backs this one, and so on and so forth. And then you get to the end, and maybe one wins, right? But then look at the amount of resources we collectively, as the ecosystem, have invested. And maybe it's healthier that way, maybe not, right? And so then the question becomes, do open source organizations have a role to play in what I call assisted pruning, right? I'm not going to call it euthanasia, I'm going to call it assisted pruning, right? So those that are struggling and not going to make it or not likely to make it, do you then let them go away, right? Is the transition strategy or end-of-life strategy that we do in products, sorry, it's a bad thing to touch, that we do in products or have done end-of-life strategy. Every product manager out there has done EOL strategy, right, up and down. Should we be doing that for open source projects, right? Something to think about, given the number of projects that we have out there. Anyhow, and then role of standards today, I almost don't want to talk about it because everyone talks about it, right? What's the role of standards? And Alan asked a good question this morning. What's the role of standards today, right? It's still ongoing, right? It's and now it's gone from, putting your right person in there on the standards body so they can advocate for you, and maybe he out-talks the other persons or, whatever it is. Now you just contribute code, right? And you try to overwhelm people with code, right? Good code, bad code, all the above, right? And then you get into the TSC, the Technical Steering Committee battles, right? So it's different battles, different battleground, but similar battles are being fought, right? But that's and then in the end, what happens? And the difference with open source versus standards is that if you don't like it, you can fork it. Right? Couldn't do that with standards. Well, you could, actually. That's not entirely true. You could, right? You could. But by and large, with code, it's much easier to fork, right? Just create a new branch. On Git, it's easy, right? Doesn't help everyone, but hey. And so, what's the role of the LF? What's the role of ONF, right? What's the role of the MEF, Etsy, TM Forum? Are they purely marketing vehicles only? Not directed at the ONF, I just want to be clear, right? Or should they be something more, right? Are they involved in building community? And should some of them give the independence voice? Because we shouldn't forget about those, that they exist, right? And it was quite interesting where the LF was talking about funding some fixes, security fixes of open source that was out there because everyone could benefit from it, right? So, I would say, I don't think it was necessarily self-serving, right? But there are independents out there that need help, right? How do we involve them? And the last part is, absorptive capacity and contribution capability. So I think for organizations that are not already in open source, I think it comes down to absorptive capacity. In other words, how do you build? I think Tom actually, said, part of it this morning, which is how do you build capabilities? How do you experiment with these open source ideas so that you have the ability to appreciate open source and take it in when you have to, if you have to, or even collaborate with the vendors to incorporate open source, right, as part of the solution. So I think that's important, building what I call absorptive capacity in organizations for open source. I think that's important. So getting involved is important. The other element is security and legal worries, which there are going to be talks on this track later on. So I would stay here for that, and understanding what that means for organizations. I think it's getting a little better. But still, I think that needs to be made clearer to organizations around those elements so that they can contribute, not necessarily always contribute code, but at least be informed consumers of open source at the very least, right? So where do we go from here? So moving right along. I think for open source and networking, I think the boundaries are not, I think they keep expanding. So the scope's going to keep expanding. It's not going to stop. Data center, campus, WAN, SD-WAN. Everything is SD-WAN, by the way, on the WAN. So it's horrible, but it is what it is. Public clouds, the transport network, the edge, and the edge is the next battleground, right? Now, again, hopefully we'll find ways to monetize it beyond CDN, watching movies and gaming, but, and maybe autonomous vehicles. But see, definition of autonomous vehicles should be they're autonomous. They shouldn't depend on the edge, right? No, I'm kidding. But anyhow. They're autonomous vehicles, right? So if the edge goes away, they should still keep driving. You don't want the cars going around killing people when the edge is not available, right? Ideally, right? Unless you have a population problem, but that's not ideal either, right? So, but anyway, so So I think fundamentally, right, the edge is interesting, but I think it still remains to be seen. I like this morning's talk where they were actually, you guys were very open about the edge use cases still being developed, and I think that's a reality today. But open source will eat the edge too. And then growth of the vertical stack up and down. So open source will eat up, open source will eat down. I think there's no doubt about it. Service mesh is open source, and it's huge, right? The FPGA, the NICs, the efforts around FPGA, and I think it's ODMA, ODF, I forget the acronym. But anyway, the chiplet design and FPGAs, right, are going to be open source as well. Switches, routers are already open source, and they'll probably get better. And then I think we'll see a lot of cross-organization efforts beyond platitudes, right? It's like, I'm your friend, you're my friend type thing, the Barney thing, right? So I think we'll see actually beyond that over time. And I think, to get the organizations to play nice across the board, there are cross-org or neutral parties, you could call Intel and ARM neutral parties, but in fact, they're invested parties, except they have everything to gain on both sides. So I guess they're neutral in that sense, right? Counteract each other. But anyhow, the chip manufacturers, right, will want to drive them to collaborate, and you're seeing some efforts around there, right? CSPs and cloud providers certainly play a role in trying to get these things to collaborate, because I think folks have a lot more to gain than not. So that's timely topic set number one. And then beyond that, I think from the ecosystem will grow before it shrinks. I think we're not seeing the end of it yet. You'll see a lot more open source projects come out from all parties, right? The LF will keep onboarding because they believe that's the way they grow. Hopefully, ONF will stop spawning 10 new acronyms every year, but we can only hope. It's hard to keep track. But I call it waiting for the Kubernetes moment. So the interesting thing, contrasting open source in the container world versus open source in the world we're in, is in the container world, so we always say the cloud moves faster, and I don't know if this is true, but a lot of the companies out there with alternatives to Kubernetes all folded very quickly, very quickly. So if you look before, there was, so Kubernetes, if you're not familiar, Kubernetes, well, hopefully you're familiar, it's the other thing besides SD-WAN that makes it round, right? So Kubernetes is actually container cluster management, right? So you want to run containers, which is a good thing, and you want to cluster manage a lot of containers. Kubernetes is it's the main thing. And it's from Google, so. But despite Kubernetes' existence, before that, there were other options available. Apache Mesos for instance, Docker Swarm was another one. And Rancher had its own. And what happened when Kubernetes came on the scene is very, very quickly, I was so surprised, all the companies folded and everyone went with Kubernetes to add value to Kubernetes. So what I call the Kubernetes moment. We haven't seen it yet in open source networking for sure, not by a stretch of imagination. And so, obviously the dynamics there are obviously different, but we'll wait for our moments where it all folds in. Open source orgs probably should cull and retire ancient projects because the last thing you want is someone accidentally coming across a project and starting to contribute to it, not realizing it's dead. Not great, right? It happens, right? It's like, oh, this is cool. Let me start, let me do a pull and let me start contributing back, and you realize, oh, it's actually dead, right? Not great, right? So waste of resources. And meanwhile, I think we're going to see this continue. It's not going to change, right? So we'll see resources diluted or invested, depending on what word you want to use, right? Continue. There'll be a battle of egos, never ends, right? All the end user confusion. We're going to sit out there trying to figure out which open source project, which one to go with, which way to go. And hopefully it evolves and shakes out at some point. And I think the cloud providers can play a key role in helping sort of drive things. And service providers too, right? I think, but certainly. But what I view as is if you're enterprise or even as communication service providers, and you're not one of the big ones who are actually generating the open source, you're trying to consume it, then I think what I call is a momentum rules, right? So it comes down to momentum, I think fundamentally, and I think that's not a bad thing, is to look for high momentum projects and to make sure that the ecosystem support is available. And if you are not able to consume OSS, open source solutions directly, you should still look to OSS solutions, fundamentally because I think there's probably a larger support ecosystem. There's likely to be better compatibility, not guaranteed, but likely to be better compatibility. There's hopefully better feature velocity, right? Combined efforts and potential portability, right? With a big caveat, right? So that would be sort of my thoughts in terms of where we go from here. And at this point, I think we're at the 29-minute point, so questions.